Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a fascinating and highly charged political theory recently presented in a Blaze TV segment featuring Glenn Beck. Now, right off the bat, our goal here isn't to validate or debunk anything. We're just going to objectively deconstruct the internal logic of this specific media narrative. We're going to impartially map out the exact arguments the source material presents so you can clearly see how they're building this framework.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the alliance theory, then shifting the demographic focus, the constitutional debate, proposed political responses, the three-headed hydra, and finally, the future landscape. Starting right off with Section 1, the unholy alliance theory, defining the core premise.
So the crucial point here, the foundation of the entire video's argument, revolves around this concept they call the red-green alliance. And it's important to note they absolutely do not describe this as some kind of permanent friendship or a natural cultural pairing. Instead, the segment outlines it as a marriage of convenience. It's a temporary political fusion between the Marxist left and the Islamist movement. According to the broadcast, what's uniting these two historically distinct forces is simply a shared desire to topple Western civilization and capitalism.
And this brilliantly illustrates the internal contradiction that the segment claims is built right into this alliance. On the left side, you've got that short-term glue, destroying the constitutional order. But on the right, you see the source's predicted long-term reality. The broadcast posits that the Islamists are essentially just playing the Marxists for short-term gain. The specific assertion they make is that once those shared goals are achieved, the Islamist faction will betray and ultimately eliminate the Marxists.
Moving right along to Section 2, shifting the demographic focus from terrorism to culture.
Having defined what this alliance is, the broadcast then pivots to explain how the nature of the threat has evolved over time. After 9/11, national security naturally focused heavily on Islamic terrorism. But the segment estimates that actual terrorists make up just a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. We're talking only about 3 to 5%. But here is where the broadcast makes a highly controversial pivot. They argue that hyperfocusing purely on that 3 to 5% is a massive mistake today. Instead, the theory outlines that the focus has to shift away from terrorism and toward a much, much larger non-terrorist demographic that they designate as culturally radicalized. And get this, the speaker in the video suggests this culturally radicalized population could be incredibly high, throwing out a number as high as 80% of that demographic. So, what exactly does this cultural radicalization look like according to the source? Well, they characterize it as an ideology that's totally incompatible with classical liberalism. They label it a conquering ideology that actively seeks to replace current American systems with Sharia. And to really hammer this point home, the speaker uses a very specific anecdote. He states that if a person believes someone should face a guilty verdict and the death penalty simply for leaving their religion, even if they believe that person should get a lawyer and due process first, then they belong to this radicalized cultural movement and do not belong in America. Which brings us to Section 3, the constitutional debate, navigating the First Amendment. Now, you might be wondering, if you're targeting a cultural and religious movement, how on earth do you reconcile that with the American guarantee of religious liberty? The broadcast answers this with a very specific interpretation of the law. Just look at this quote straight from the video. If your religion teaches that the Constitution must be replaced, now it is a political organization. You're now saying it's a system of governance. The speaker posits this exact framework to argue that radical Islam should not be protected merely as a religion. Now, what's really interesting about this is how this framework attempts to entirely bypass First Amendment protections. By relabeling the faith as strictly a political organization and a competing system of governance, the theory concludes it becomes fundamentally incompatible with the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, following their logic, it just doesn't qualify for standard religious liberty protections. It's a clever, albeit super controversial, legal framing designed specifically to justify government intervention. All right, let's look at Section 4. Proposed political responses, actionable legislative steps. With this legal and cultural framework established, the video provides some highly actionable legislative steps to counter this perceived threat. First up, politicians need to publicly admit the sheer scale of the problem, moving way beyond just looking at that 3 to 5% terrorist demographic we talked about earlier. Second, work closely with allies in state and federal legislatures to craft policy. And third, and this is easily the most explosive proposal, actively refuse to seat elected candidates from the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, if they openly oppose the Constitution. To defend this pretty wild strategy of Congress literally refusing to seat duly elected officials, the broadcast draws a super strict distinction between standard political disagreement and outright constitutional disqualification.
For example, the speaker points to figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He notes that while his side disagrees with her on virtually everything, she generally doesn't overtly call for overthrowing the Constitution. However, the video asserts there are newer candidates who proudly proclaim anti-constitutional goals. And the speaker says it's these specific politicians who should be constitutionally disqualified from taking the oath of office.
Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds into their next core concept, the three-headed hydra, dismantling the support structure. The theory argues that this alliance doesn't just operate in a vacuum, right? It's propped up by a powerful, multi-layered support structure that they categorize into three pillars, what they call the three-headed hydra. First, you have the enablers, which the broadcast identifies as influencers in the mainstream media who provide cover for the alliance. Second are the legitimizers, defined as intellectuals in academic institutions giving the movement philosophical backing. And finally, the backers, the massive financial networks actually funding these initiatives. By organizing the opposition into these three buckets, the segment outlines exactly how one might systematically target and dismantle the alliance's life support.
And finally, Section 6, the future landscape, electoral pushback, and the Overton window. So having laid out the threat, the structure, and the solutions, the speaker predicts a massive demographic pushback. He argues that traditional Democratic voting blocs, specifically working-class, Christian, Hispanic, and Black families, are watching this radicalization unfold and are, frankly, horrified. He posits that these voters might not suddenly flip and become Republicans, but they will absolutely begin choosing more moderate, rational Democrat voices to push out the radicals.
The segment frames this changing landscape by referencing the Overton window. Now, for those who might not know, the Overton window is basically just the range of policies that are politically acceptable to the mainstream at any given time. The broadcast asserts that this window has been artificially shifted so rapidly and so far to the political left that people who were once considered standard centrists are now somehow being labeled as the radical right.
Which leaves us with this really fascinating final thought. By understanding how this specific broadcast defines the Red-Green Alliance, how it navigates the First Amendment, and how it targets institutional enablers, you can get a much better grasp on the actual mechanics of modern political messaging. So the question to leave you with today is this. As these media narratives continue to collide, how will shifting Overton windows and rapidly changing voter demographics ultimately impact and reshape our real-world political landscape moving forward? Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining us on today's Explainer.